to a burning fall. Canada is closing in on 70,000 square miles incinerated since May, and that's now more than the entire state of Florida. From BrazilReports.com, the governor declares environmental emergency as much of Brazil's Amazonas state burns. The government of the state of Amazonas in Brazil declared an environmental emergency last week as more than 4,000 fires were recorded since the beginning of September. 4,000. Statistically, mathematically, the Amazon is already doomed. It's only a matter of time. The writing's on the wall. When we lose forests like the Amazon, our days are numbered. From the New York Times, the reach of wildfire smoke is going global and undoing progress on clean air. There was no progress on clean air. That was all simply a facade because they don't measure for, let alone report, the climate engineering nanoparticle fallout that is the single greatest source of atmospheric particle pollution. And about the wildfire smoke going global, that's part of the plan. Search this very important short video report, one of our most important, Wildfires Serve Geoengineering Agenda. While on the subject of power structure agendas, about all the suspiciously timed earthquakes in countries that refuse to conform with the dictates of empire. Lights seen before or during an earthquake. The Independent reported, quote, strange earthquake lights spotted above Morocco moments before devastating tremors, and that remains a mystery to scientists. From the Jerusalem Post, mysterious flash illuminates Moroccan sky moments before earthquake. From the UK Daily Mail, parallel headline, mysterious lights were spotted in the sky before Morocco's devastating earthquake hit last week, and scientists don't know what caused them. The same phenomenon was witnessed before many major quakes: Turkey, Haiti, New Zealand, Japan, and more, each time in lockstep with troubling political circumstances, aka not cooperating with the Western power structure. Am I promoting other nations by criticizing my own? No. I'm simply citing facts. Next, are there seismic weapons of mass destruction that could cause the atmospheric illuminations? Short answer, yes. Ionosphere heater transmission installations like HAARP in Alaska can bounce their powerful signals off regions of the atmosphere that have been saturated with electrically conductive elements like aluminum nanoparticles from geoengineering jet dispersions. When these powerful transmissions are directed into the strata of a seismically sensitive region, seismic activity can be triggered. The available science on this subject is clear and not disputed. The criminally insane are running the planetary asylum. You're listening to the weekly installment of the commercial-free, non-political Global Alert News Report, the end of the world as we know it broadcast, brought to you by geoengineeringwatch.org, the largest and most visited website in the world on the subject of global climate engineering operations, aka weather warfare. Reaching a critical mass of awareness is the only way forward in this fight. Geoengineering Watch shirts, hoodies, and our full-color printed climate engineering awareness materials can get the conversation going with family and friends. Every day counts in this all-important battle. Geoengineering Watch awareness-raising materials can be found on the homepage of Geoengineering Watch. Our only goal, to fully expose and halt the climate engineering assaults. Moving on, more power structure agendas. This question, where have all those genetically modified mosquitoes gone? And what's the agenda behind them? From Patch.com, this, California endures worst mosquito season in years. When will it end? Question mark. Report says, as the blood-sucking ankle biters take a bite out of the Golden State, human West Nile virus cases are spiking. If it seems like the mosquitoes are getting worse in California, that's because they are, the report says. At the same time, human cases of the mosquito-borne West Nile virus are spiking across the state, prompting counties from Alameda to Riverside to spray entire neighborhoods. That's got to be good for your health, isn't it? They end with this: West Nile virus is now endemic in California. This invasive species is more aggressive than the native mosquitoes, more likely to bite its victims over and over again. Question, could this possibly be convenient for the controllers and seemingly familiar? Mosquitoes, tiny flying hypodermic needles, and now with this new species, if the first injection, bite, doesn't work, there's a second and a third. As the report stated, biting its victims over and over again. Question: as the planet's life support systems continue to unravel, do the controllers see an advantage in increasingly sickened, debilitated, and dysfunctional populations? You decide. Here's some notes on the bottom line of unfolding biosphere collapse. Very, very dire notes. Please listen carefully to this science report headline and the very dire information it covers. Here's the title: Seafloor methane tipping point reached. From the report, sea ice constitutes a latent heat buffer, consuming incoming heat as it melts. While the ice is melting, all energy goes into changing ice into water, and the temperature remains at 0 degrees C or 33 degrees Fahrenheit. Once all ice has turned into water, all subsequent energy goes into heating up the water. Once Arctic ice has become very thin, ocean heat that was previously consumed by melting the sea ice no longer gets consumed by melting of the ice, and further incoming heat instead gets absorbed by the Arctic Ocean, rapidly pushing up the temperature of the water of the Arctic Ocean. We are hurling toward what's called a blue ocean event, loss of summer sea ice in the Arctic, at which point all of this equation goes exponential. But continuing with this report, the latent heat tipping point has been crossed. The loss of this buffer is linked to the seafloor methane tipping point, i.e. the point where additional heat reaches the seafloor and destabilizes hydrates contained in the sediments of the seafloor. This tipping point comes with multiple self-reinforcing feedback loops, such as explosive growth in methane volume, setting off further destabilization, rapid rise of Arctic temperatures, loss of permafrost, and loss of albedo. That's the reflectivity of the ice, and release of even more methane greenhouse gases. That's the feedback loop. If you want to see what these methane blowout craters look like, please search Siberian methane craters. Look at those images and keep in mind that on the seafloor, those craters are 10 times bigger. More from the report. The current situation is particularly precarious in the Arctic, as the North Atlantic region is very hot and the Gulf Stream keeps pushing hot water toward the Arctic Ocean. I've been over this in many broadcasts. Climate engineering altering upper level wind currents, that alters ocean currents, and now is creating the scenario just described. While the Arctic sea ice has become very thin, and again, the latent heat tipping point has been crossed. More. As the temperature of the Arctic Ocean keeps rising, more heat can reach sediments located on the seafloor, since much of the Arctic Ocean is very shallow and sediments at the seafloor of the Arctic Ocean can contain vast amounts of methane hydrate. The danger is that additional heat will destabilize hydrates in these sediments, leading to explosive eruptions of methane. Its volume increases 160 to 180-fold, resulting in huge eruptions of methane, both from the destabilizing hydrates and from methane that is present in the form of free gas underneath the hydrates. This is what's been happening in the Bermuda Triangle for decades: warming oceans, thawing methane hydrates and clathrates on the seafloor. The fields released in their entirety, aerates the water like a bottle of champagne, migrates the water column to the surface. The ships above that have no buoyancy. They go to the bottom intact. Been happening for decades. Those in power know it. And their attempt to mask it with climate engineering operations is only making it worse, just like the pharmaceutical industrial approach to the human body. Here's more from the report. Ominously, very high methane levels continue to be recorded at Barrow, Alaska. How high? Some readings that are 6 to 7 times higher than at any time in the last several million years. And methane, for the record, in the atmosphere over a 10-year time horizon is 120 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. Climate engineering, again, in the attempt to hide it, making all of it worse, using weather as a weapon, covert weapon of war all over the globe, making all of it worse. The seafloor methane report continues. A catastrophe of unimaginable proportions is unfolding. Life is disappearing from Earth, and a runaway heating could destroy all life. At 5 degrees C heating, most life on Earth will have disappeared. When looking only at near-term human extinction, 3 degrees C will likely suffice. That doesn't bode well. Unfiltered frontline temperature data indicates that we're already past 3.5 degrees C of warming now since the pre-industrial baseline. All that I just described are some of the components in a scenario known as Venus syndrome. If you want to know more about how dire that scenario is, search geoengineeringwatch.org, Venus syndrome, for that report. But many would ask, if this is the case, everything I described, and we're past these boundary points now, why are we still here? Because just as was the case when Thelma and Louise crashed through the guardrail and were sailing through the air toward the bottom of the canyon, impact, though not immediate, is still imminent. There's no going back. You can't go back through the guardrail once you've gone through it. And now the stunning final conclusion from the polar scientists behind this report. Quote, the situation is dire and getting more dire every day, which calls for a, quote, climate emergency declaration and implementation of comprehensive, effective action as described in the climate plan. And exactly what is their plan, these polar scientists? To immediately deploy global climate engineering operations. Question, how's that going after 75 years of deployment? Again, welcome to the asylum. Pressing on from BBC, Antarctic sea ice at mind-blowing low alarms experts. From that report, the sea ice surrounding Antarctica is well below any previous record winter level. Satellite data shows this, a worrying new benchmark for a region that has once seemed resistant to global warming. They were able to hide some of the disappearance of Antarctic sea ice by massive chemical ice nucleating operations, sea surface operations, but those come at the cost of an even worse overall warming, so thus eventually all unravels at even faster rates. The report then says Antarctica's huge ice expanse regulates the planet's temperature as the white surface reflects the sun's energy back into the atmosphere and also cools the water beneath and near it. Here's the stats on that. Polar sea ice typically reflects 90% of the sun's incoming thermal energy. Once it's gone, the ocean absorbs 90% of that thermal energy, a complete reversal of the equation. The report then says without its ice cooling the planet, Antarctica could transform from Earth's refrigerator to a radiator. This is incredibly dire news at both poles. Let's keep going. There's more. An unstable Antarctic could have far-reaching consequences. There's no could, no may, no might. Would is the correct term. Polar experts warn. Scientists are still trying to identify all the factors that led to this year's low ice. This year's record warm oceans are likely a contributing factor, scientists suggest. Warm water will not freeze. Question, does it take a power structure institution trained in degreed so-called scientists to tell us this, that warm water will not freeze and it melts ice? And they think this might be a part of the equation. They then say there's potential for an unstoppable feedback loop of ice melting. It's not a potential, it's already triggered. There's no stopping it. The question is, will anyone survive the ride to the bottom of the canyon, as described earlier? Are we awakening this giant of Antarctica? Asks Professor Martin Siegert, a glaciologist at the University of Exeter. Professor Siegert then stated, it would be, quote, an absolute disaster for the world. Well, it is. There's no stopping it at this point. Final statement from the report. This is from the same glaciologist mentioned a moment ago. He stated, when I started studying Antarctica 30 years ago, we never thought extreme weather events could happen there. Yes, there you have it. Another example of trained, clueless, so-called scientists from the controller-owned climate science community. For the record, over the last year, temperatures in Antarctica have been as much as 70 degrees Fahrenheit above normal, completely off the scale. Pressing on from Carbonic.com, space mission to explore Venus runaway hothouse climate. Could it happen on Earth? Consider everything I covered in this broadcast and 423 previous broadcasts of Global Alert News. It's already unfolding and accelerating. Again, search geoengineeringwatch.org Venus Syndrome to learn more. Is there a wild card in this equation that could yet buy us time to change our course? Yes. Fully exposing and halting climate engineering operations and then focusing on doing the same with countless other forms of unimaginably destructive human activity. From Alaska Public Media, this. Another example of the collapsing biosphere. 4 years into the Yukon salmon collapse, an interior Alaska village wonders if it will ever fish again. The report says the river's once strong king salmon run has been a long, slow decline since the 1990s. Chum salmon have also been unpredictable, but in the last 4 years, both species runs have abruptly crashed. Researchers are still unsure exactly what's driving the collapse. How can they possibly be unsure? Oceans are collapsing all over the world. They're superheating. Plankton populations are collapsing. The forager fish are collapsing. The bottom links of the food chain are completely blowing apart. How can they not have a clue what's going on? And this is what we pay our so-called scientists for. The power structure utilizes their complete cluelessness to keep the population apathetic until the last possible moment. New from phys.org. The pace of climate-driven extinction is accelerating, new study shows. And now let's rewind to last April. From A to Z animals.com, a few headlines to cover here. Stay with me while I put these puzzle pieces together. The report says it's hard to believe that up to 200 species go extinct every day. Going even further, up to 73,000 species go extinct throughout an average year. And those figures, as dire as they sound, are actually short of the current true figures. It's actually up to 300 species a day. Now let's move to September of this year from Britannica.com. What I'm trying to point out is, even from what some would consider a credible source of information, their statistics are completely uncorrelated. Here's the example. From Britannica, ecologists estimate that the present-day extinction rate is up to 10,000 times the background extinction rate. That's definitely alarming, and they're close to the mark there. It's actually 15,000 times higher. But then they state this, that the extinction rate is between 1 and 5 species per year. That's completely, ridiculously wrong. They say it's because of deforestation, habitat loss, overhunting, pollution, climate change, and other human activities, the sum total of which likely results in the loss of these species. And that part is true, but again, we're talking about missing the annual extinction total by perhaps 100,000. In fact, let's do the math. 365 times up to 300 species a day, 365 times 300, 109,000, something in that range. And they're saying 1 to 5 species a year? How do things like this even get published? And from Britannica.com, no less. For the record, the current rate of species extinction, plant, animal, and insect, is now believed to be, again, 15,000 times the background rate of extinction. That's 1.5 million% of so-called normal. That's the rate of 200 to 300 species of plant, animal, and insect per day. That's how fast we're experiencing extinction at this moment, and never in Earth's geologic past has it occurred at anywhere near this rate. And we have people going about their lives as if nothing is wrong. As mentioned at the start of this broadcast from so-called Scientific American, alluding to the insanity that's becoming all but impossible to hide in our skies. Here's the headline: it's time to engineer the sky. From the report, global warming is so rampant that some scientists say we should begin altering the stratosphere to block incoming sunlight, even if it jeopardizes rain and crops, as if it's not doing that already and hasn't been for decades and decades. The report then states this: many people recoil at the notion of solar geoengineering, or solar radiation management, aka SRM, as it's often called, the idea that humans should try to fix the atmosphere they've messed up. Again, that's the words of Scientific American, by messing with it some more. And that seems fraught with peril. You think? They continue, an act of Faustian arrogance certain to backfire, but as it becomes clear that humans are unlikely to reduce emissions quickly enough to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees, let's be clear on that. There's no emissions reduction. There was never a plan to reduce emissions. All the COP conferences, climate conferences, are simply smoke, mirrors, facade to strong-arm nations into cooperating with climate engineering so they can keep pedal to the metal and keep business as usual until the last possible second. That's what those conferences are about. And so this climate article from Scientific American is simply trying to continue the facade. They say that if we reduce emissions fast enough to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, sometimes scientists say SRM might be less scary than allowing warming to continue unabated. More from this report titled Time to Engineer the Sky from Scientific American. It says solar radiation management could produce effects quickly. It has political appeal. It is, quote, the only thing political leaders can do that would have a discernible influence on temperature within their term in office. That last statement was from Ken Caldera, a climate scientist emeritus at the Carnegie Institution for Science. Carnegie has a long, dark background, research that, who is also a senior scientist at Breakthrough Energy, an organization funded by Bill Gates. Stick with me, there's more. In 1965, scientists reported to President Lyndon Johnson that warming caused by rising greenhouse gases could be addressed by spreading reflective particles across the oceans. This is in 1965, and we have so-called scientists today telling us this is some fringe theory. In 1974, Russian climatologist Mikhail Budikos stated that injecting SO2 into the stratosphere via aircraft would reflect sunlight. This technology, he wrote, should be developed without delay. Perhaps surprisingly, these proposals did not include the idea of reducing emissions. Of course they didn't. They want business as usual until the brutal, bitter end. The report continues with this. Dimming the sun would cool the planet unevenly, Ken Caldera states. He said you get much more cooling at the equator, more cooling during summer, and less at the poles. The poles are warming 4 to 6 times faster than the rest of the world, exactly like Caldera states. So, Mr. Caldera, you're saying what would happen with the climate engineering operations if they were actually ongoing, which of course we know they are, is exactly what is happening. Should that be any surprise? After 75 years of climate engineering, that Ken Caldera will never, ever admit to. And let's not forget what Dr. Ken Caldera stated on the record, an audio that geoengineeringwatch.org owns. Again, his voice stating that when he was a Department of Defense scientist, one of his tasks was to design ways of spraying pathogens into clouds to infect the populations below. You can listen to this yourself. Geoengineeringwatch.org, The Faces of Climate Engineering Disinformation is, I believe, the name of that report. Please, please connect the dots. Next, from newscientist.com. High-flying microplastics could pose a threat to the ozone layer. No could, no may, no might. And let's remember that one of the primary elements in climate engineering patents and operations are polymer fibers. And the ozone layer is disintegrating by the day. All of these puzzle pieces completely connect. From this report, microplastics may float higher in Earth's atmosphere than previously thought. There we see it again. We didn't know. We had no idea. We didn't think this before. What is the so-called climate science community for? They're for pacifying populations, pretending they don't know how bad it is until the last possible moment. How come we knew at geoengineeringwatch.org? I've been trying to sound this alarm for 15 years with the website, and for another 5, 6, or 7 on top of that. 20 plus years slogging in this battle, trying to swim against the tide of the power structure owned so-called climate science community, and not just the climate science community, other so-called science communities that have done nothing but deceive populations about the most dire threats imaginable. That's the world we live in. The so-called experts without a clue, by design, armed with so-called higher learning degrees that are nothing more than certificates of indoctrination from the controllers of the matrix and the institutions that they own. More headlines from CBS. Homes in parts of the U.S. are essentially uninsurable due to rising climate risks. Again, climate engineering will never be mentioned in those equations. I have passed on so much data to insurers like State Farm and the rest. They don't care. There's money coming into them from the back door to keep their mouths shut. That's how